Welcome to our CSOC seminar, and it is a great pleasure for us at CSOC that Kerem Oktem, who the majority of you in this room, I'm sure that you know him very, very well. But for us in particular, at CSOC, it's a great pleasure to have Kerem always come back to us and talk to us about his work or even see him socially. Kerem has been together with Calypso and Dimitar Bechev and Julie, one of the original pillars of CSOC, so he knows this our program from the beginning, from the first years. And now he's a professor, having gone through various positions here at the European Studies Center and having done a lot of research and excellent work, among others his book, The Angry Nation. He is now a professor at the University of Graz of Southeast European politics, with a focus also on Turkey. And whenever Kerem comes here, we always try to find the opportunity to have him here speak to us. You're very topical, obviously, because it's after the elections, and I'm not going to speak any longer because we will have to finish at 1:35 the latest, as Kerem has to go to London to give yet another lecture on this topic.
So, no, fortunately not on this topic, but thank you very much, Othon. I mean, the topic I'll be speaking about in London is even more kind of heart-wrenching. It's sort of, I mean, I'm so glad to be here in Oxford, and I'm so glad to see you and friends and familiar faces that it all, I mean, actually makes me quite unhappy that I have to speak about such a dire theme like Turkey after the elections. But also because, I mean, these days we're living through are particularly dire ones and sad ones. That's also why I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, because I do not want to show any more pictures. I think we've seen too many pictures of, you know, destruction, of death, of dead bodies, and I don't want to show any more of them, even though they do appear in what I'm going to talk about. Of course, I'm not going to talk that much about the election as such. There has been, I think, a panel discussion at the Middle East Center last week with Güney Yıldız, whom I know personally, who's a very kind of close follower of developments in Turkey, and Laurent Mignon and others. But of course, I will remind you about the run-up to the elections, to both elections, which we've seen in the last few months, and then the aftermath of them, and then in conclusion try to make sense of what current developments mean conceptually and for understanding of things to come in Turkey, and of course then probably in the question and answers what it means for the relationship of Europe and Turkey, which I see becoming a much more geopolitical, realpolitical relationship. I'm not sure it's helping any democratization efforts in Turkey, but that could be a theme of our discussion. Now, briefly about the elections on November 1, what happened, you've all followed it, but again, our agenda has been so full in the last few weeks that, you know, what happened like 2 weeks ago feels already like a very long time ago, because yes, there were the Ankara bombings, there were the Turkish elections, there were the Paris bombings. I mean, there's a lot we have to be kind of interested in at the moment. So just a reminder there, what happened on November 1st, around 10%, which had left the AKP in the June 7 elections, came back to it. That meant not 50%, but 49% of the AKP. And they came mostly from the pro-Kurdish HDP and the nationalist MHP, which had both kind of massively gained votes in the June 7 elections. I mean, one of the reasons also why I don't have PowerPoints is that, of course, there are a lot of graphs about the election outcomes, about the voter behavior, but the problem is that all polling companies in Turkey, whether they were pro-government or anti-government, got the election results completely wrong. I mean, they were expecting an AKP victory in the band between 40 and 43%, and nobody foresaw the kind of electoral success that happened. So actually, after having got it so wrong, it doesn't make much sense to use kind of graphs from the same companies which explain why people or how people kind of shifted. Now, there are three explanatory models for this massive vote swing which have been discussed recently. There's the manipulation thesis, obviously the first one which comes to mind, that there might have been widespread vote rigging. There's the consolidation thesis, which suggests mostly Ersin Kalaycıoğlu and Kemalist kind of sociologists who would say that now you have a conservative right-wing bloc consolidated in Turkish politics, around 50%, that will be there forever and will rule the country forever. Quite a self-defeatist kind of argument, I think, but it's also been it's quite widely circulating. And then there's the fascism thesis, of course. Umut Özkırım and scholars of nationalism have made that argument. It's basically like within the German kind of comparative case, Turkish people have chosen for Islamofascism, for the Islamofascism of Erdogan. Again, I'm not so sure about that, but we can discuss this. And then there's a slightly more maybe analytical thesis, or the one which I feel more close to in my attempts at explaining it, is the voter intimidation thesis, and which goes very much back to the 1912 elections of the Committee of Union and Progress in 1912, which were called the elections with a stick, where people were basically kind of forced into voting for the Committee of Union and Progress. Now that's 1912, but we have very kind of comparable modes of intimidation, of kind of intimidating people into voting for the AKP. I think this is probably the most credible way of looking at it. But the general agreement, no matter what kind of explanatory avenue you would follow, is that, of course, these elections were neither, the November ones, neither free nor fair, but the counting of votes, I mean the casting of votes and the counting of votes has been overall accurate and fine. It has, because the outcome has not been contested by any of the major parties. There are a number of important civil society groups like Oy Ötesi, which has been present with representatives at more than 50,000 polling stations, and they're about 150,000. So they were present at 1/3 of polling stations, and had there been major irregularities, it would have come up in their kind of results as well. So the election results have not been questioned overall, and that's the outcome we all now need to work with. But I think it's more important, and that's why I said I won't talk that much about the election results as such, is what happened before November 1st, and why they took place in the first place as well. So that, of course, brings us back to the elections on 7th June. That's the elections which people like me and the good liberals and the good Europeans, of course, love. That's the liberal moment, the kind of moment when we all went to our open democracy kind of papers and wrote that the Turkish people, whenever there's a danger of authoritarianism, they will vote for the only political alternative to authoritarianism, and they will vote for democracy. I mean, that's what I wrote in my open democracy piece, and that was, of course, when the AKP lost 10%, and when this kind of big project of turning Turkey into a presidential system, executive presidency, pretty much failed because the AKP had lost that political support. And these were elections which also happened under very bad circumstances. I mean, the run-up to the 7th of June elections were again kind of terribly divisive and sectarian politics by the AKP, the insistence on this executive presidency, the singling out of particular groups. I mean, kind of like truly hate politics. I mean, hate speech used in election campaigns for the first time in that kind of fashion. But also growing collective violence against Kurds in Western towns. I mean, of course, some of them spontaneous, but most of them most probably not spontaneous. A lot of commentators referred to this as the worst election period in living memory of Turkey. I mean, pretty much since 1912, since this which still was the Ottoman Empire, of course. one very important outcome or moment of those elections was, the pro-Kurdish party, the HDP, and the rising star of Selahattin Demirtas, or the person whom a lot of people in Turkey, at least left-wingers, likened to the party to Syriza very much, and also its leader to the leader of Syriza. And of course, I don't know whether that's such a good reference point, but it was this kind of idea that there was a completely new type of politics emerging, a brief moment, a possibility of societal reconciliation. I mean, and it was a very exciting thing. Think about it, like the HDP is the pro-Kurdish party which has kind of emerged out of this national, ethno-national struggle for Kurdish identity and Kurdish nationhood or Kurdish autonomy. And that party kind of says, no, we're not just an ethnic party, we want to go beyond that, we want to be a progressive social party which brings together all parts of the country and kind of brings Turks and Kurds together in a progressive socialist, but neo-socialist project. And a progressive agenda, especially in terms of women's rights and LGBT rights. That was an impressively progressive party, so a pro-Kurdish party transforming into an all-Turkey party. Of course, one could discuss whether this was possible at all in the first place. I mean, first of all, is it possible at all for an ethno-nationalist party to really not only shed its ethno-national ideological foundations, but then also kind of step above that and become like a kind of all Turkey party, especially when the main group was coming from the Kurdish southeast is actually quite a socially quite conservative place. I mean, that was very much a balancing act, but it was an exciting possibility for people in Turkey, and which also connects a bit to the Gezi Park protests and so on. I mean, this was pretty much the only party which managed to kind of speak to that constituency of young, urban, kind of new people who want a different style of government. Of course, we had massive kind of attacks against this party. Just before the war, there was an attack on the election rally in Diyarbakir with several people killed, but still they got 13%. And that's more than the ethnic Kurdish vote in the country. So they were able to get like at least 3%, which were not from the ethnic Kurdish camp, and those are the 3% which most likely also returned. Now, what is important to note is that the outcome of the elections of the 7th of June, where the AKP was the largest party with 40%, but not able to form the government, that outcome could have led to some form of political coalition between more than one party. The AKP was not able to establish that coalition, but what's important here is that that President Erdogan, after that option did not work out, would have had to ask the second party for a coalition, to form a coalition. And that never happened. And that is, I think, really the kind of point after which the Turkish context has left the logic of democratic politics. I mean, I'm not sure whether this was clear enough. Usually, like in many other countries as well, the president would first ask the first winner, the winner of the elections to form the government, and that failing, he would ask the second largest party. And that second question never materialized. That means that the opposition was never given the chance to form a government. I mean, somehow there has been this impression that it was the coalition, the opposition, which was so badly organized and was not able to form a government. That was actually not the case. I mean, they didn't have the chance. I mean, when they got the chance, whether they would have managed, that's another question. But the fact that they were not given that was actually the moment after which we have pretty much left the realm of democratic politics. Which then now brings us to the campaign period of what many called the repeat elections, of the November elections. And and that was really a repeat also of the worst election period in living memory, which was the June one. Only that was even worse. I mean, this time we had an escalation both invisible and in what I call deep politics or deep state politics, which has been. Which really has topped the status quo. This is something, again, a new ball game in many ways. With the AKP kind of really going through a shift in language, becoming truly belligerent, with a crackdown on opposition media, again, with a change of repertoire. I mean, until now it's been mostly kind of legal challenges, tax evasion charges against opposition newspapers, but this time we had first threats by members of the party, and then thugs attacking the newspaper buildings. That's a different kind of way of conducting politics, like really kind of fascistic kind of thugs, young men, kind of attacking the doors of the newspaper. And of course, the takeover into state administration one day before the election of a oppositional newspaper which was close to the Gülen movement. So again, I'm just going through these because in order to make my claim that talking about the election results is important as well, but actually that's not the most important story here. Of course, we also had this language, and that brings me to the elections with a stick, the politics of threat inscribed into the language. I don't know, and one of the most important sentences there was, if you don't, to the Kurdish electorate, if you don't for us, the white Renaults will return. And for the observer or followers of Turkish politics, they know exactly what the white Renaults stand for. Those were like the cars of the paramilitary organizations, which would kind of go around in the Kurdish areas and, take in Kurdish dissidents and then often kill them or kind of, dump their bodies at the roadside. So, that's actually a very kind of clear threat. And a threat, but, it's not a discursive threat because, in fact, the white Renaults have already returned to the scene. And I think that's an important point to make. And you will remember these big trials like Ergenekon and so on against the deep state. It's a long story. I won't go into that. We can discuss that later if we have the time. But the fact is that those were after the break of the Erdogan regime with the Gülen movement. Those were the first court cases to be stopped, and you had hundreds of people who walked free from those trials. There were big problems with those trials. Some of them were based on fabricated evidence, but still, many of the people in jail were actually true offenders, and they walked free. And we have a lot of evidence that they're now actually back in the field, so to say, in the Kurdish cities, and actually have continued their work from the 90s, which is paramilitary kind of provocations to force the Kurds into a major uprising, which then can be put down with military force. And there's a lot of evidence. It might sound a bit kind of too much of all conspiratorial to you, but we have had like a number of cases in the run-up to the elections where whole cities, smaller cities like provincial towns in the Kurdish areas were put under curfew for like up to 10, 11 days. And the image after those 10, 11 days was, Gaza is a pretty good kind of comparative case. They're complete destruction, but more importantly, slogans on all doors and houses, which are kind of very evocative of the 90s and that deep state kind of language of, like the Turkish state is back. And, we have shown you the force or the power of the Turk and that kind of imagery. Anyway, I won't go much more in these kind of really dark moments. But of course, there's another side to this. The PKK, the pro-Kurdish guerrilla, played, of course, happily along. The Turkish government would not have been able to do all this had nobody responded. The PKK basically showed quite clearly that it didn't quite like their political representation, the pro-Kurdish party, the HDP, turning into a kind of social democrat, kind of pro-gay, women's rights party. I mean, not because they're conservative, but because they believe that they stand for a different type of ethno-national politics. And that's why they engaged in this escalation. So what we've seen is a mutually agreed but not controlled escalation process which has happened in the region. Now, with these two election periods in mind, I think it becomes relatively clear that to discuss whether the election results as such are, or whether the elections are free and fair is not the most important question. Another question which we could probably ask is what was the role of the EU, Merkel's kind of last-minute visit to Ankara, and this general, now with the G20, as if nothing had happened, like the whitewashing, real political whitewashing of Erdogan. But leave that for later. What is relevant is, of course, how we can conceptualize this new reality, or how we can at least understand it, put a name tag on it so that we can be a bit more relaxed about it, maybe. I see four kind of possibilities of naming what's happening at the moment. On the one hand, or there are actually four different approaches out there in the literature as well. Obviously there's the one about turn to comparative authoritarianism, Levitsky and so on. This is something we talked about in a symposium we did in October with lots of comparative work on Bolivia and Chavez, and which was actually very insightful to see, how populism, even if it's, on the opposite side of the agenda, leftist on the one side and Islamo right on the other, can actually work through very comparable kind of languages, argumentative structures, singling out of the elites, creating like a new revolutionary language, and all that. So that's one thing. The second, of course, is this a victory of radical Islamism, could be asked. Is this a government that is now mostly intent on regime maintenance and political survival? Or is this a government ready to exercise fascistic methods of governance, ready to kill or accept the killing of groups within its own population? And, I actually believe that the current picture of Turkey's political field combines all four characteristics, and in which the competitive authoritarianism side is almost the more benign kind of moment. The fact that there is still elections, yes, the build-up to it is highly manipulated. There is no change is really allowed. That's why the elections were repeated, because the outcome was considered the wrong one. But still, the fact that the ballot box is still in the picture, that is probably the best of what we have at the moment. In terms of radical Islamism, when you listen to Davutoğlu's victory speech, I just couldn't believe it. It was the word God, Allah, Allah, Allah. It was like as if he was kind of reciting a prayer. I've never heard anything like that in the world. That is even in itself an interesting point. But also the kind of narrow Sunni ideology which Erdogan has been talking about, this kind of feeling against religious minorities, especially the Alevis. There are examples of an Islamic overhaul of the education system up to a point, of course, but all this kind of does suggest the radical Islamist path as well. Well, when it comes to regime maintenance and political survival, of course, we have last year when I was here, I talked about the political economy that rests. That is quite familiar from Russia and Mubarak's Egypt as well, with like one man as like the big linchpin, and but the problem is that like a crony capitalist system basically with. Big companies being created out of government contracts, which is a system which can work well as long as the economy is growing. But that economy has been very sluggish for the last few years, about 2 years, so this kind of system is not really working anymore. So what we have is like an increasingly extractive kind of form of politics, massive corruption, and we of course remember the corruption cases from December 2013, which actually, their becoming public started this more radicalization of the regime, and then we also have Erdogan's fear as a person of destruction. I mean, there's a psychological double bind at the moment, a fear of extinction on the one side and of total control on the other. So it's like this: on the one side you have something between après moi, le déluge, and Hitler in the Führerbunker kind of feeling, you know, and on the other hand you have this excitement to be like the leader of the Islamic world, you know, maybe become an Islamic caliph, even though, of course, the possibility of this has receded. And then finally, the issue of what I call fascistic mode of governance. Again, as the economic system is nearing its demise in a way, what we see is this rising extraction. So you have to do more in order to get money out of a shrinking economy, which means, you know, like less regard for health and safety, kind of complete oppression of any kind of protests against, say, big infrastructure projects like hydroelectric power plants and you know, like these big infrastructure projects, and that necessitates, of course, then violence against these resistance movements. More importantly, and there we, I think, go back to the 90s, these fascistic methods of governance become most visible, not in Western Turkey so much, but in the Kurdish areas. I mean, these curfews of 10 days, you know, basically reducing these cities almost to rubble, civilians kind of having to run away in the cover of night and so on. I mean, these are kind of images of like civil war, just that the state is imposing this war on the Kurdish people. I mean, that is quite close to fascism. So now, where do we go from here? So if we have come to this kind of framework of competitive authoritarianism to fascism as a range and a political space filled by a government that is radicalized by its struggle for survival, for political survival. And which is also, and that's also probably important, it's still a coalition, but not a coalition as it was in the earlier 2000s of liberals and other kind of religious movements, Kurds and so on. But it's a coalition now of deep Islamist ideologues on the one side and non-ideological opportunists on the other. I mean, they act within the repertoire of the language of radical Islam, but they're completely, complete opportunists. I actually know some of them, like by family relation, and it's amazing, like the level at how they can stretch, like being engaged in this fascistic project on the one side and enjoying like the beauties of a rather suave Istanbul life on the other. And I sometimes think about how I can make life unbearable for them, but I'm not yet come up with a solution for that. But so, to allow some time for discussion, I'll be closing. But what can we expect from this? Unfortunately, I do believe that we will have more of all the above. I mean, more fascism, particularly more war in Kurdistan, more takeover of opposition media, and also of universities. That's important. I mean, all those very important liberal institutions we know, like Sabancı, like Bilgi, like Koç. There's a new kind of ordinance which has just become law, I think, which allows the state to take over foundation universities if they believe they engage in seditious activities against, yes, it's sedative activities. Seditious activities against the state, and that's of course a terrible threat. I mean, which means, for instance, like in a place like Sabancı University, where Ayşe Kadıoğlu is the dean of the social sciences, where she will at some point have to see what can and cannot be done in research in order to prevent the state from kind of taking over. For now, this might be just a threat, and the threat which is probably directed more at the pro-Gülen universities than at the liberal ones, but once the threat is once the kind of mechanism is there, states of course often like to use it. So, not so nice. But of course, all of this is happening under, and that's important. I mean, this is happening under conditions of severe economic, political, and regional crisis. I mean, you asked today, now there's like they have almost 49%, so is this good that there is political stability? But of course, that they got 49.5%, the AKP got 49.5%, does not mean that there is political stability. Quite the opposite. I mean, you now have a deeply fragmented society, deeply fragmented, where 49.5% has voted for the AKP, but 10% of those would have been more critical. They've basically been beaten back. I mean, that's my argument, beaten back to vote for it. And we have 50.5%, which pretty much hates the AKP and what it's doing from its heart. So very kind of unstable politics. What I see is that the kind of political economic bargain, which made the AKP such a big success, which over much of the 2000s, much of the last decade, which made it possible for the AKP to distribute, despite a very neoliberal kind of growth pact, made it possible to distribute some of that kind of growth into redistribute it quite generously, and build up a health system and a social system which was quite impressive. That is simply not possible anymore, and so I think that the political economic foundations of the this AKP government is definitely gone. So the power project of Erdogan and the AKP in this form, I think, will fail. It's a question of not of if, but of when. But that moment of failure may, of course, not be as imminent as the good liberals or many of us hope. And once we sift through the ruins of the AKP legacy, Turkey might be a very different place from the one we used to know. But this is roughly the perspective I will give you today. Thank you.